The AirTag was smaller than I'd expected when I slipped it into the inner pocket of Chester's leather briefcase while he showered that Tuesday morning. At 63, I never imagined I'd be tracking my husband of 35 years like some paranoid wife from a crime thriller. But Chester's behavior over the past few months had become impossible to ignore. It started with the phone calls, whispered conversations that ended abruptly whenever I entered the room, followed by nervous explanations about old engineering colleagues and retirement planning consultations. Then came the schedule changes. Sudden departures every Friday afternoon, always accompanied by vague explanations about errands and appointments that lasted exactly 2 hours. "Viv, I'll be back around 5, Chester said that morning, kissing my forehead with the same gentle affection that had characterized our marriage since 1988. "Just need to handle some business downtown." "What kind of business?" I asked, noting the way his jaw tightened. "Nothing important, sweetheart. Just boring financial paperwork that would put you to sleep." Chester had been giving me variations of that same answer for 4 months, and I was tired of feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. After he left, I opened the Find My app on my iPhone, a piece of technology my grandson Jake had taught me to use for locating lost devices, and watched the small dot representing Chester's briefcase move through our suburban neighborhood toward downtown Portland. The route was familiar by now. He took the same streets, made the same turns, and arrived at the same destination every Friday at precisely 3 p.m. The Riverside Hotel on Morrison Street, an upscale establishment catering to business travelers and wealthy tourists. What my 65-year-old husband was doing at an expensive hotel every week was a question that had been keeping me awake at night, my mind cycling through scenarios that ranged from concerning to devastating. The most obvious explanation was infidelity. I'd seen enough daytime television and read enough magazine articles to know that affairs among older adults were increasingly common, especially after retirement, when couples suddenly found themselves spending more time together than they had in decades. Chester and I had been adjusting to retirement differently. I'd embraced the freedom to read, garden, and volunteer at the local library. Chester, on the other hand, seemed restless, dissatisfied with the slower pace of our new life. He'd made comments about feeling useless and invisible, remarks that suggested he was struggling with the transition from productive professional to idle retiree. Perhaps he'd found someone who made him feel vital and desired again. Perhaps our comfortable but predictable routine had become suffocating in ways he couldn't express directly. The thought of Chester with another woman made me physically ill, but I forced myself to consider the possibility with the same analytical approach I'd used during my 30 years as a high school mathematics teacher. What evidence supported this hypothesis? What alternative explanations could account for his behavior? Chester's Friday absences were remarkably consistent. Same departure time, same destination, same duration. If he was having an affair, it was conducted with the precision of someone scheduling medical appointments rather than the passion of someone consumed by desire. There were other inconsistencies too. His appearance hadn't changed. His interest in our relationship remained steady. His emotional availability was normal, except for the obvious anxiety surrounding Friday afternoons. But then again, Chester had always been methodical. If he were having an affair, he'd probably approach it with the same systematic planning he'd applied to his engineering career and our household finances. That Friday afternoon, I tried to distract myself with chores while monitoring his location. The dot representing his briefcase remained stationary at the Riverside Hotel from 3:15 p.m. until 5:05 p.m., just as it had for the past 16 weeks. When Chester returned home at 5:30, he seemed more relaxed than he'd been all week, almost cheerful in a way that made my stomach clench. "How were your errands?" I asked, studying his face. "Fine, sweetheart. Nothing exciting. You seem happier. Did something good happen?" "Just nice to get out of the house and handle some business, Viv. You know how restless I get sitting around all day." That evening, Chester fell asleep easily while I lay awake planning my next steps. If my husband was having an affair, I needed concrete evidence before confronting him. Evidence strong enough to justify a conversation that could destroy our marriage and fracture our family. And if he wasn't having an affair, then I needed to understand what was important enough to require weekly clandestine meetings at an expensive hotel. The next morning, while Chester worked in the garden, I searched his home office. Chester had always been meticulous with financial records, everything neatly filed in labeled folders. What I found only deepened my confusion. Hidden behind insurance documents and investment statements was a manila envelope containing dozens of bank deposit slips for an account I'd never seen before. The deposits were substantial, amounts ranging from $15,000 to $40,000, occurring monthly for several years. The bank was First National downtown. We had never used that bank. Our retirement savings, checking, and investments were all managed through Columbia River Credit Union, where we'd been members since moving to Portland 3 decades earlier. I photographed several slips, noting the consistent pattern of large cash deposits that coincided with Chester's mysterious Fridays. Whatever was happening at the Riverside Hotel involved serious money. Some wives suspected infidelity and discovered emotional betrayal. I was beginning to suspect something far more dangerous. On Monday morning after Chester left for his weekly grocery trip, I called First National downtown. My hands trembled as I dialed. First National Downtown Customer Service. How may I help you? I'm calling about an account that may be under my husband's name. I need to verify some information for tax purposes. I provided the account number, Chester's full name, and the Social Security number I'd memorized over 35 years of joint tax returns. Mrs. Hartwell, the representative said after a pause, I do show an account under that number. However, I need to verify your identity. Are you listed as an authorized user? I'm not sure. My husband handles most of our finances. I'm organizing our records after his retirement. Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Hartwell, this account has 2 authorized signatories, Chester Hartwell and someone named Donovan Hartwell. Are you related to Donovan Hartwell? My blood turned to ice. Donovan Hartwell was Chester's twin brother. Donovan Hartwell had died in a car accident 40 years ago. Yes, ma'am, the representative continued. Donovan Hartwell is listed as the primary account holder, with Chester Hartwell as the secondary signatory. The account was opened in 2015 and has maintained a substantial balance with regular monthly deposits. After the call ended, I sat in Chester's office, staring at the deposit slips spread across the desk. Donovan Hartwell was dead. I'd attended his funeral in 1983. I'd watched Chester grieve for months, struggling with survivor's guilt that haunted him for years. There was no possibility, none, that Donovan was alive. Unless everything I believed was wrong. Public records told a disturbing story. The accident report confirmed Donovan's death, but identification had been made through dental records and personal effects. The body had been severely damaged. Chester had insisted on a closed casket funeral. At the time it had seemed like compassion. Now it felt like something else entirely. That evening, Chester returned home cheerful and relaxed. How was your day, sweetheart? He asked. Fine, I said carefully. Just organizing paperwork. You find anything interesting? The question sounded casual. It wasn't. Just trying to understand our financial accounts. Viv, you don't need to worry about that. Everything's managed. Our retirement is secure. I looked at my husband of 35 years. Chester, I said. Do we have accounts at any banks other than Columbia River Credit Union? The room went quiet. He kept unloading groceries, his movements suddenly tense. Why do you ask, sweetheart? I just want to understand our complete financial picture, I said carefully. Sometimes I feel like I don't know enough about our money management. In case something happens to you. Viv, nothing's going to happen to me, Chester replied gently. And yes, I have some business accounts at other institutions for investment purposes. Nothing you need to concern yourself with. Business accounts? I asked. Chester, what kind of business are you involved with? Nothing dramatic, sweetheart. Just some consulting work to supplement our retirement income. Engineering firms sometimes need experienced consultants for specialized projects. His explanation sounded reasonable, plausible enough to calm a less suspicious wife. But it didn't explain the involvement of his supposedly dead twin brother. And it didn't explain the substantial cash deposits that had been occurring monthly for 8 years. That night, I made a decision that would either confirm my suspicions or prove that grief and paranoia were distorting my rational thinking. I was going to follow Chester to his Friday meeting at the Riverside Hotel. Some wives followed their husbands and discovered affairs, painful revelations that could, in time, be addressed through counseling and forgiveness. I was about to discover whether my husband was involved in financial crimes that could destroy our family's security and possibly put us in physical danger. Because if Donovan Hartwell was somehow alive and managing secret accounts with Chester, then my comfortable retirement rested on foundations I neither understood nor trusted. Friday morning arrived heavy with consequence. Chester followed his usual routine. Coffee, newspaper, casual conversation about weekend plans. Meanwhile, I prepared for covert surveillance that felt both necessary and absurd for a 63-year-old retired math teacher. "I'll be back around 5, Viv," Chester said, kissing my cheek with the same affection that had sustained our marriage for more than 3 decades. "Just need to handle some business downtown." "Drive carefully, dear," I said. "They're predicting rain this afternoon." After he left, I spent 30 minutes preparing for an operation inspired by crime television and online articles about investigating suspicious spouses. Dark clothing that wouldn't draw attention. Sunglasses despite the overcast Portland sky. A baseball cap pulled low to obscure my profile. And a camera with a telephoto lens, borrowed from our neighbor under the pretense of photographing birds in our backyard. The drive downtown took 25 minutes, giving me time to position myself across from the Riverside Hotel well before Chester's scheduled 3 p.m. arrival. I parked with clear sightlines to the entrance while remaining inconspicuous among the steady stream of downtown traffic. At exactly 2:58 p.m., Chester's silver Honda Accord pulled into the valet area. Through the telephoto lens, I watched my husband step out wearing the charcoal gray suit he reserved for important occasions. He carried the leather briefcase, the same one containing the AirTag I'd planted 4 months earlier. Chester moved through the lobby with unmistakable familiarity, greeting the concierge with casual recognition, and heading straight for the elevator bank without stopping at the front desk. His behavior suggested long-established routine rather than recent arrangements. I waited 10 minutes before entering. The Riverside Hotel lobby was elegant but understated, filled with business travelers and well-dressed locals, perfect camouflage for a woman trying not to be noticed. "Excuse me," I said to the concierge who had greeted Chester earlier. "I'm supposed to meet a colleague for a business appointment, but I've forgotten which room we reserved. Could you help me locate Chester Hartwell?" "Mr. Hartwell is in suite 1247, ma'am," he replied. "The elevators are just behind you. Suite 1247. Not a conference room. Not a restaurant. A private hotel suite." My stomach churned as the implications settled in. Whatever Chester was doing required privacy and discretion, conditions consistent with both romantic affairs and illicit business dealings. I took the elevator to the 12th floor, my heart pounding. The hallway outside suite 1247 was quiet and empty. I positioned myself near the emergency stairwell, where I could observe without being seen. Through the door I heard muffled voices, at least 2 people. The words were indistinct, but the presence of another person was unmistakable. At 4:15 p.m. the suite door opened. Chester stepped out. Behind him emerged a man who nearly caused my legs to give out beneath me. He was identical to my husband. Same height, same build, same face. But his appearance radiated wealth and authority. Tailored clothing, confident posture, a presence that contrasted sharply with Chester's nervous deference. They weren't merely similar. They were twins. They could have been Chester and Donovan Hartwell, despite the fact that Donovan had supposedly been dead for 40 years. My hand shook violently as I raised the camera, managing to take several photographs as they walked toward the elevator. I wasn't sure whether the images would be clear enough, but I had to try. As they waited, fragments of conversation drifted toward me, enough to freeze my blood. "The monthly transfer needs to be completed by Tuesday. They're getting suspicious about the source documentation. If the authorities start investigating the accounts, your family's safety depends on maintaining absolute discretion." The elevator arrived before I could hear more. I remained hidden in the stairwell until I was certain both men had left the hotel. Then I returned to my car, carrying evidence that would either save or destroy my marriage, depending on what I chose to do next. Chester Hartwell was meeting weekly with someone who looked exactly like his supposedly dead twin brother. They were discussing financial transfers, suspicious documentation, and threats to our family's safety if authorities became involved. Either Chester was being coerced into illegal activity, or he was a willing participant in crimes involving enormous sums of money and the potential for violence against anyone who interfered. When Chester returned home at 5:30 p.m., relaxed and cheerful, I felt as though I were living with a stranger. "How was your day, sweetheart?" he asked, kissing my forehead, completely unaware that his wife had spent the afternoon uncovering evidence of criminal conspiracy. "Fine, dear," I said evenly. "Just a quiet day at home." "Good. I'm looking forward to a peaceful weekend with my beautiful wife." As Chester settled into his armchair with the evening newspaper, I understood that our weekend would be anything but peaceful. Some wives followed their husbands and discovered infidelity, painful truths that could be addressed through honesty and forgiveness. I had followed my husband and discovered evidence of criminal activity involving a man who should have been dead for decades, financial transactions that suggested money laundering, and explicit threats against our family. Tomorrow I was going to demand answers, and whatever those answers were, they would either save our marriage or destroy our family forever. Because the alternative to confrontation was continuing to live with a man whose secrets could place us all in mortal danger. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in a deceptive sense of normalcy, the kind I knew would be shattered within hours by conversations that would either explain or condemn everything I had discovered about Chester's secret life. I made coffee and scrambled eggs while my husband sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. We both performed familiar domestic routines that felt surreal given what I had witnessed the day before at the Riverside Hotel. "Chester, we need to talk about something important," I said, setting his coffee beside the newspaper. My hands trembled despite my effort to appear calm. "Of course, sweetheart," he replied, lowering the paper slightly. "What's on your mind?" "I need to know who you were meeting yesterday at the Riverside Hotel," I said. "And I need to understand why that person looked exactly like Donovan." Chester's newspaper froze halfway to the table as my words registered. The color drained from his face so quickly that I thought he might be having a heart attack. His hands began to shake as he carefully set his coffee cup down, as though maintaining physical control might preserve the rest of his composure. "Viv, what are you talking about?" he asked. "I don't know anyone at the Riverside Hotel." "Chester, I followed you yesterday," I said. "I saw you come out of Suite 1247 with a man who looked identical to you. I heard pieces of your conversation about monthly transfers, suspicious documentation, and threats to our family's safety. You followed me?" His voice cracked. "How could you do that? Why would you spy on your own husband?" "Because my husband has been lying to me for months about his Friday activities," I said. "And because I found bank records showing an account with $6.3 million in it. An account under Donovan's name. A name that belongs to a man who supposedly died 40 years ago." Chester stood abruptly and began pacing the kitchen, his movements frantic and agitated, like someone whose carefully constructed deception had finally collapsed. "Viv, you don't understand the complexity of this situation," he said. "There are things about my family I've never been able to tell you. Secrets I've carried for decades to protect you and our children." "What kind of secrets, Chester?" I demanded. "Donovan didn't die in that car accident in 1983, he said quietly. "He staged his death to escape federal prosecution for financial crimes he'd been committing since college." The room spun as he confirmed what I had begun to suspect but had been unable to accept as reality. "Donovan faked his death?" I said. "How is that possible?" "I attended his funeral. Chester, we buried him. We buried an unidentified homeless man," he said. "A body Donovan substituted for his own after the accident. He was already involved with organized crime figures who helped him obtain false identity documents and disappear completely from law enforcement surveillance." "And you've known this for 40 years, I said. "You let me grieve for your brother while he was alive somewhere else." "Viv, I thought Donovan was gone forever," Chester said. "I believed staging his death ended our relationship permanently. I grieved for him just as much as you did, because the brother I grew up with did die when he chose criminal activity over family." He sat back down across from me, his face carrying the weight of decades of deception. "Then why have you been meeting with him?" I asked. "Why do you have joint bank accounts? Why are you involved in whatever criminal activity he's continued pursuing. Because 8 years ago, Donovan reappeared in my life, Chester said. He told me he needed help with financial arrangements that would protect our family from people who wanted to hurt us. What kind of people? His expression darkened. Donovan has been working as a money launderer for drug cartels operating between Mexico and the Pacific Northwest, he said. His job is to take cash from drug sales and convert it into legitimate investments in bank accounts that can't be traced by law enforcement. And what does that have to do with you? He told me cartel leaders had discovered his connection to me, Chester said. They threatened to kill you, our children, and our grandchildren unless I helped manage financial transfers that kept his operations running smoothly. The implications made me physically ill. Our family had been living under death threats from drug cartels for 8 years, while my husband laundered money to keep us alive. Chester, why didn't you tell me? I asked. Why didn't we go to law enforcement? Because Donovan warned me law enforcement had been infiltrated by cartel informants, he said. He said any attempt to seek protection would alert his employers. He told me our only safety came from continued cooperation. So for 8 years, I said, you've been laundering money for drug dealers who threatened to murder our family. I've been transferring funds and managing documentation, he said, tears filling his eyes. Helping Donovan maintain his position with people who could eliminate our entire family without hesitation. He reached across the table for my hands, his voice breaking. Viv, every Friday I meet with a brother who should be dead, he said. I commit crimes that could send me to federal prison for life, because the alternative is watching our children and grandchildren die. How much money? I asked. Approximately $15 million over 8 years. I pulled my hands away and stood, needing physical distance to process the reality that my husband was a federal criminal who had been protecting our family through organized crime. What happens if you stop cooperating? I asked. What happens if the cartels decide they don't need you? What happens if law enforcement discovers your involvement? I don't know, Chester said. I've been living with those questions every day for 8 years. Some wives discovered their husbands were having affairs and faced decisions about forgiveness or counseling. I discovered my husband was laundering money for drug cartels under threat of family execution, and that our comfortable retirement was financed by criminal proceeds that could destroy us. We were trapped between law enforcement and organized crime, with no safe exit and no guarantee that continued cooperation would protect us. By evening, we sat at the kitchen table surrounded by financial documents, burner phones, and emergency contact information Chester had maintained in secret for years. Show me everything, I said. I need to understand the full scope. He retrieved a hidden safe from behind the water heater in the basement and returned with files documenting his transformation from respected engineer to reluctant money launderer. The Mendoza cartel controls trafficking from Tijuana to Seattle, he said, spreading photos and charts across the table. Donovan has been their primary financial coordinator for the Pacific Northwest since 2015, laundering roughly $50 million annually. And your role? I manage the technical side, he said, structuring transfers under reporting thresholds, coordinating dozens of accounts across multiple banks to avoid detection. I stared at the statements, realizing the $6.3 million account was only one piece of a vast financial web. How many accounts? 47 accounts across 12 banks in Oregon, Washington, and California. The documents included detailed profiles of our children and grandchildren, addresses, schedules, schools, workplaces, compiled by professional surveillance teams. They know where Emma works, Chester said, where the kids go to school, where Jake plays Little League. These people have been watching us for 8 years, I whispered. And Donovan? I asked. Why do they trust him? Because he's been in organized crime since college, Chester said. Long before he faked his death. He showed me photographs from the 1980s, Donovan with known crime figures, a hidden criminal career spanning decades. When Donovan reappeared, Chester said quietly, he wasn't my brother asking for help. He was a professional criminal recruiting me for operations that required both engineering expertise and legitimate financial credentials. Engineering expertise? Viv had asked him. What does engineering have to do with money laundering? Modern money laundering, Chester explained, required a sophisticated understanding of banking software, electronic transfer protocols, and financial monitoring systems. Donovan needed someone who could design technical solutions capable of moving massive amounts of cash without triggering automated federal surveillance. Someone who could make illicit money disappear into the legitimate financial system without leaving a trace. Viv felt sick as the truth settled in. Chester's professional skills hadn't made him a random victim. They had made him uniquely valuable. They hadn't threatened their family by chance. They had targeted him. So this was never about protecting us from random violence, Viv said quietly. They recruited you because your expertise was essential. Exactly. Donovan framed the threat to our family as leverage, motivation for my cooperation. But the real reason they wanted me was my ability to design financial transfer systems federal agencies couldn't detect or trace. Chester, what happens if we go to the FBI? Viv asked. What kind of protection could they actually provide? Donovan had already answered that question for him. He warned me that federal agencies have been trying to infiltrate the Mendoza organization for years without success. That means they don't have reliable intelligence about cartel operations, and they don't have the resources to protect witnesses long term. Chester had shown her the articles. Families who tried to cooperate with federal investigations against drug cartels. Families enrolled in witness protection programs. Families murdered anyway, parents and children alike. Federal protection works against conventional criminals who operate within legal systems. It's far less effective again. International organizations with unlimited money, reach, and patience. Groups that can locate and eliminate witnesses no matter how deep they're buried under official protection. So our choices are continued participation in criminal activities, or probable death for our entire family. Those have been our choices for 8 years. Viv, every Friday I commit felonies that could destroy our lives because the alternative is watching our children and grandchildren die horrible deaths. That evening, Viv called their daughter Emma using the secure communication protocols Chester had established for family emergencies. Mom, you're calling from a strange number. Is everything okay? Emma, your father and I need to discuss some family security issues that may affect you and the children. Can you and Mark come home this weekend? We need to have an important family meeting. Security issues? Mom, you're scaring me. What kind of security problems? The kind that require difficult decisions about safety and protection. Emma, please don't discuss this conversation with anyone except Mark. And don't use electronic communication to coordinate your travel. After ending the call, Chester and Viv spent hours talking through options that all felt impossible. Continued criminal participation, immediate flight from the country, or cooperation with federal authorities who might not be able to protect them. Viv, there's one more option we haven't discussed. What option? We gather evidence against the Mendoza organization, evidence valuable enough that federal authorities would be forced to offer extraordinary protection. What kind of evidence? Financial records documenting their entire laundering operation, account numbers, transfer protocols, organizational structure. Enough to dismantle their financial network completely. Chester, if we're caught doing that, they'll torture and kill us and everyone we've ever loved. And if we don't try to escape, we'll eventually be caught by federal investigators anyway. Then we face life imprisonment while still being vulnerable to cartel retaliation. Some families struggle with job relocations, elder care, or retirement planning. Our family was deciding whether to keep laundering drug money or risk violent death trying to escape criminals who had monitored our every move for 8 years. Whatever choice we made would determine whether our children and grandchildren lived or died, based entirely on whether the criminal justice system could protect witnesses from an international cartel with unlimited resources for revenge. Emma and Mark arrived Sunday morning. Their faces were pale. The expressions of parents who had spent the entire drive from Eugene preparing for news that could endanger their children. Jake was in California with his family, but Emma had convinced Mark that any emergency involving secrecy and warnings justified immediate travel, children included. Mom, Dad, what's going on that requires this level of secrecy? Emma asked as they settled into the living room. Mark went downstairs to supervise 6-year-old Sophie and 9-year-old Tyler playing video games. Chester and Viv had spent Saturday night debating how much to tell their adult children. Full disclosure could traumatize them, and increase their risk if fear drove bad decisions. Too little disclosure could leave them blind to danger they wouldn't recognize. Emma, your father has information about threats to our family's safety that require difficult decisions about protection and security, Viv said carefully. What kind of threats? Dad, are you in trouble? Chester took a deep breath. The truth would shatter Emma's image of her parents' quiet retirement and financial stability. Emma, for the past 8 years I've been forced to participate in criminal activities. People connected to drug cartels threatened to kill our entire family if I refused to cooperate. Criminal activities? Dad, what are you talking about? I've been laundering money from drug sales, managing bank accounts and electronic transfers designed to hide criminal proceeds from federal monitoring systems. Mark re-entered the room just in time to hear the confession. His face registered pure shock. Chester, are you saying you're working for drug dealers? I'm saying drug dealers have been forcing me to work for them by threatening to murder everyone I love, including Sophie and Tyler, if I try to escape or contact law enforcement. Emma stood abruptly, pacing the room, her movements sharp and frantic. How long has this been happening? How long have we been in danger without knowing it? Since 2015. For 8 years, your children have been under surveillance by professional criminals who could kill them at any moment if I failed to cooperate. And you never told us? You never warned us? Warning you would have put you in even greater danger. These people kill entire families to silence witnesses. They have the resources to locate and eliminate anyone connected to their operations, no matter what federal protection is promised. Got it, refreshed, tightened and clarified without cutting any of the script or changing the events. I focused on smoother flow, clearer dialogue beats, and stronger emotional pacing while preserving every decision, threat, and timeline exactly as written. Mark dropped heavily into Chester's armchair, visibly struggling to process the reality that his children were living under active death threats from international drug cartels. Chester, what do we do? He asked hoarsely. How do we protect Sophie and Tyler from people with unlimited resources for violence? Chester turned the tablet toward Emma and Mark, showing them the same surveillance profiles he had revealed to me the previous day. 8 years of professional observation. The files documented our grandchildren's school schedules, playground routines, and after-school programs in chilling detail. These people know everything about our family's routines and vulnerabilities, Chester said. They know where the children are every hour of every day. They have operatives positioned to eliminate them immediately if I fail to comply with financial instructions. Emma's voice trembled, barely containing panic. So our choices are continued participation in criminal activities, or watching our children die violent deaths. Chester nodded grimly. Those have been our choices for 8 years. But Viv and I have been discussing a third option. One that might give us a way out without living under permanent threat. What option? Mark demanded. We gather evidence against the organization. Evidence valuable enough to federal authorities to justify extraordinary protection for our entire family. I laid out the financial records and organizational charts Chester had been secretly maintaining, explaining our tentative plan to cooperate with federal investigations in exchange for witness protection that would relocate our entire family under new identities in secure locations. Mom witness protection programs are designed for individuals, not extended families with young children, Emma protested. And there's no guarantee federal agencies could protect us from international criminals with unlimited resources. There's also no guarantee that continued criminal participation will protect us indefinitely, Chester replied. At any moment, they could decide we're security risks and eliminate us to prevent future testimony. Mark studied the documents with his accountant's eye, clearly grasping the scope and sophistication of the laundering operation Chester had been managing. This shows millions of dollars in transactions over multiple years, Mark said quietly. Federal agencies would absolutely be interested in intelligence that could dismantle operations of this scale. But gathering additional evidence means continuing to participate while documenting activities, Chester said. That increases the risk of detection by people who torture and kill witnesses. That afternoon, we contacted Jake in California using secure communication protocols, explaining the family emergency without revealing details that could endanger him if communications were monitored. I'm flying home tonight, Jake said after listening. Whatever this is, it can't wait. Don't use electronic communications to coordinate travel, Chester warned. And don't discuss this conversation with anyone except Sarah. Dad, Jake said, shaken, you're terrifying me. What kind of safety threats require this level of precaution? The kind that could endanger your children if we don't handle this carefully and professionally. By evening, the family was gathered in the living room, debating options that ranged from continued criminal participation to fleeing the country, to cooperating with federal authorities who might not be able to protect us adequately. I vote for federal cooperation, Jake said after reviewing the evidence. We can't keep participating in drug trafficking, and we can't live hiding from both criminals and law enforcement. There's one more factor, Chester said quietly. What factor? Mark asked. Tomorrow is Friday. I'm scheduled to meet Donovan for weekly financial instructions. If I don't show, or if I behave suspiciously, the cartel will assume I'm cooperating with federal authorities and will immediately begin eliminating family members. Some families planned weekend gatherings to celebrate holidays or anniversaries. Ours was planning survival strategies that would decide whether our grandchildren lived to see their next birthdays. And we had less than 12 hours to decide whether Chester would continue laundering money for drug cartels, or risk family annihilation by attempting escape from criminals who had controlled our lives for 8 devastating years. Thursday night passed without sleep as we finalized a plan that balanced survival with the possibility of dismantling one of the most dangerous criminal organizations on the West Coast. By dawn, we reached consensus on an approach that terrified everyone, but offered the only realistic hope of long-term escape. The FBI field office in Portland has a specialized organized crime unit, Jake said, showing research he'd conducted using secure public internet access. Agent Patricia Morrison leads operations against international drug trafficking organizations. She has experience with witness protection cases involving families. How do you know this? Chester asked sharply, concerned about surveillance. I used public computers at the airport, Jake replied. No accounts. Nothing traceable to us. Emma reported her own research. If federal cooperation fails, New Zealand has immigration programs for families with financial resources and professional skills. We could establish residency within 6 months if we start now. Fleeing the country makes us federal fugitives in addition to cartel targets, Mark said. And international criminals can reach families anywhere. In the end, the plan was set. Chester would attend his scheduled Friday meeting with Donovan, wearing FBI surveillance equipment, to document cartel operations and financial activity. Federal agents would monitor the meeting from nearby locations, gathering evidence while remaining ready to intervene immediately if Chester's safety was compromised. The risks were substantial, I acknowledged as we reviewed the final details. If Donovan suspects Chester is cooperating with federal authorities, they'll torture him for information about our family's location and federal protection arrangements. And if Chester fails to attend the meeting, they'll assume betrayal and begin eliminating family members immediately, Jake added grimly. At 10 a.m., we contacted FBI agent Patricia Morrison using procedures Jake had researched for reporting organized crime activity. Within 2 hours, Agent Morrison and 3 colleagues were sitting in our living room, reviewing financial documents that represented 8 years of meticulously recorded money laundering evidence. Mr. Hartwell, this documentation could enable us to dismantle the Mendoza organization's financial network and arrest dozens of conspirators involved in drug trafficking operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Agent Morrison explained after studying Chester's records. Agent Morrison, I asked, what kind of protection can you provide for our family during the investigation and prosecution phases? We can offer immediate relocation to secure housing, new identities for all family members, federal security details for your grandchildren, and ongoing protection throughout legal proceedings that could extend for several years. And what happens if your protection fails? I pressed. What happens if cartel operatives locate us despite federal security measures? Agent Morrison's expression became appropriately grave. Mrs. Hartwell, federal protection programs have been successful in over 90% of cases involving organized crime witnesses. However, the Mendoza cartel is a sophisticated criminal organization with resources that exceed most domestic criminal groups. There is a 10% chance that your family could still be targeted despite federal protection. There is also a 10% chance that standard protocols may need to be enhanced with extraordinary security measures that would significantly restrict your family's freedom and mobility. At 1 p.m., federal technicians equipped Chester with advanced surveillance equipment designed to document criminal conversations while providing real-time monitoring of his safety during the meeting with Donovan. The recording devices are virtually undetectable, Agent Morrison explained, as technicians concealed microphones and tracking equipment within Chester's clothing and briefcase. We'll monitor your conversation from nearby locations and intervene immediately if you're threatened or detained. If Donovan discovers the surveillance equipment, we'll arrest him immediately and place your family in emergency protection while preparing for probable cartel retaliation. Chester left for his final meeting with Donovan carrying evidence that could either save our family or result in our deaths at the hands of criminals who had controlled our lives for 8 years. Emma, Mark, Jake, and I waited in the living room with FBI agents who monitored Chester's location and conversations through sophisticated electronic equipment, providing continuous audio and GPS tracking. At 3:15 p.m., Chester's voice came through the speakers as he entered Suite 1247 at the Riverside Hotel for what we hoped would be his last meeting as an unwilling money launderer for international drug traffickers. "Hello, Donovan. You look well, Chester. You look nervous. Is everything all right? With your family?" "Everything's fine, brother. Just tired from managing so many financial transfers lately." "Good," Donovan replied, "because I have some concerning information about federal investigation activity that might affect our operations." My heart stopped. Donovan's awareness of law enforcement activity could mean our cover had already been compromised. "What kind of federal activity?" Chester asked calmly, despite knowing that his life and ours might depend on his composure over the next hour. "Federal agents have been investigating financial institutions we use for transfers. They're looking for patterns that indicate organized money laundering." "Do they suspect our accounts?" "Not yet, but they're getting closer to identifying the technical methods we use to avoid detection." Through the surveillance equipment, we listened as Donovan provided Chester with instructions for establishing new accounts and revised transfer protocols designed to circumvent evolving federal monitoring systems. "We're also implementing enhanced security procedures for our weekly meetings," Donovan continued. "Starting next week, all participants will be checked for electronic surveillance equipment before we discuss operational details." Agent Morrison met my eyes with grim understanding. If Chester attended another meeting, his cooperation would be exposed, and he would be executed. "We need to arrest Donovan today," Agent Morrison said quietly. "If those procedures go into effect, Mr. Hartwell won't survive the next meeting." At 4:30 p.m., federal agents arrested Donovan Hartwell as he left the Riverside Hotel, ending his 40-year career as a professional criminal and initiating legal proceedings that would dismantle the Mendoza cartel's financial operations. Chester returned home that evening as a federal witness rather than a money launderer, carrying evidence that would place dozens of drug traffickers behind bars for decades while freeing our family from 8 years of criminal control. "Is it over?" Emma asked as Chester embraced our grandchildren for the first time in years without fear. "The criminal part is over," Chester replied, "but we'll live under federal protection for several years while testifying against everyone involved." Some families spend their retirement traveling, gardening, and enjoying grandchildren in peaceful domestic routines. Our family would spend the next phase of our lives in witness protection, testifying against international drug traffickers while learning to live without the constant fear of assassination by criminals who no longer controlled our choices. For the first time in 8 years, our grandchildren could play in their backyard without cartel operatives watching and cataloging their vulnerabilities. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our new home in a small town outside Denver, watching Chester prepare breakfast with a relaxed demeanor I hadn't seen since before Donovan's return. "The pancakes are almost ready, Vivian," he called, using my new identity with the casual ease we developed after months of rehearsing cover stories. I was now Vivian Barnes, married to Charles Barnes for 35 years, recently relocated from Minnesota due to my husband's consulting work with federal agencies. Our children were now David and Rebecca Cooper, living with their families in nearby towns under similar protective arrangements. For the first time in nearly a decade, our lives were no longer dictated by fear. Charles, Agent Morrison called yesterday with updates about the prosecution timeline. The trials won't begin until next spring, which means we'll be living under federal protection for at least 18 more months. How are you feeling about the extended timeline? Honestly, relieved. For the first time in 8 years, I'm not waking up terrified that our grandchildren could be murdered because of your brother's criminal activities. The past 6 months have been transformative for our family in ways that went far beyond geographic relocation and identity changes. Chester had been receiving therapy to address the psychological trauma of 8 years spent participating in criminal activity under the constant threat of family assassination. I, meanwhile, had been working with counselors to process the betrayal and fear that had defined the later years of our marriage. Chester, how do you feel about Donovan facing life imprisonment without the possibility of parole? My husband paused in his pancake preparation, the spatula hovering midair as he considered his relationship with the twin brother, who had manipulated him into criminal conspiracy, while threatening the lives of the people Chester loved most. I grieve for the brother I lost in 1983, when Donovan chose criminal activities over family relationships. The man who's been sentenced to federal prison isn't really my brother. He's a stranger who happened to share my DNA, while dedicating his life to activities that destroyed families and communities. Do you feel guilty about his arrest and prosecution? I feel guilty about participating in criminal activities for 8 years without finding the courage to seek help sooner. I feel guilty about allowing fear to prevent me from protecting our family through legal means. But I don't feel guilty about Donovan facing the consequences of 40 years of criminal choices. Federal prosecutors had used Chester's evidence to secure convictions against 37 members of the Mendoza cartel, including financial coordinators, drug distributors, and enforcement operatives who were responsible for dozens of murders and millions of dollars in illegal drug trafficking. Agent Morrison said that your testimony helped federal agencies understand money laundering techniques that other criminal organizations have been using throughout the Pacific Northwest, I told Chester as we ate breakfast in our secure kitchen. They've been able to identify and prosecute financial crimes that might have continued for years without your inside knowledge. I'm glad that something positive came from 8 years of criminal participation. If our testimony helps prevent other families from being threatened and coerced, then maybe our suffering serves some useful purpose. That afternoon, I received a call from Emma, now Rebecca, reporting that Sophie and Tyler were adjusting well to their new school and identities, despite the challenges of maintaining false backgrounds while building genuine friendships. Mom, the kids are resilient, but they sometimes struggle with remembering their cover stories during casual conversations with classmates, Emma explained during our weekly check-in call using secure communication protocols. How are you and Mark handling the transition? Better than expected. Mark's new job with the accounting firm is going well, and I'm enjoying teaching at the elementary school. It's strange living under false identities, but it's also liberating to know that our children are safe from criminal surveillance. Jake, now David, had relocated his family to a town 40 miles away, where he'd established a consulting practice that utilized his business expertise while maintaining his cover identity as someone with no connection to federal law enforcement activities. Dad, Sarah, and I have been discussing whether we want more children now that we're not living under constant threat of cartel retaliation, Jake had told Chester during his last visit. For the first time in years, we could plan for the future without wondering if our family would survive long enough to see our children grow up. The most challenging aspect of our new life involved maintaining relationships with extended family members and long-term friends who couldn't be informed about our relocation or identity changes. Chester's colleagues from his engineering career, my friends from the library where I'd volunteered, and neighbors who'd been part of our community for decades all believed that the Hartwell family had simply moved away for retirement reasons. Sometimes I miss our old life, I admitted to Chester as we took our evening walk through the quiet neighborhood where federal protection had relocated us. I miss our garden, our house, the familiarity of routines we developed over 30 years in Portland. I miss aspects of our old life too. But I don't miss the fear, the secrecy, or the constant anxiety about our family's safety. This new life is built on honesty instead of criminal participation. Do you think we'll ever be able to return to normal civilian life after the trials are completed? Federal authorities have said that cartel retaliation remains possible even after convictions, which means we may need to maintain protected identities indefinitely. But Viv, this protected life, with our real values and honest relationships, feels more normal than anything we experienced during 8 years of criminal coercion. Dr. Martinez, the trauma therapist who'd been working with our entire family, had explained that recovery from prolonged criminal victimization often involved redefining concepts of normalcy and safety rather than simply returning to previous life patterns. Families who've survived organized crime threats often discover that their relationships become stronger and more authentic once fear and secrecy are eliminated. Dr. Martinez explained during our family therapy session. The shared experience of surviving extreme danger can create a deeper appreciation for ordinary domestic happiness. That evening, as Chester and I sat on our new front porch watching neighbors tend their gardens and children play in nearby yards, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation our family had undergone since I first placed that AirTag in Chester's briefcase. Chester, do you ever regret that I followed you to the Riverside Hotel? Do you wish I'd never discovered your meetings with Donovan? Viv, your discovery of my criminal activities was the first step toward freedom our family experienced in 8 years. If you hadn't been curious about my Friday meetings, we might have continued living under cartel control until federal agencies discovered our involvement through other investigations. And then we would have faced prosecution as willing participants rather than coerced victims. Exactly. Your surveillance and investigation probably saved our family from federal prosecution, while providing evidence that helped convict genuine criminals instead of their victims. Some wives who followed their husbands discovered infidelity that could be addressed through marriage counseling and forgiveness. I followed my husband and discovered criminal conspiracy that required federal intervention to save our family from drug cartels, while dismantling international money laundering operations. And our family's survival required abandoning everything familiar about our previous life to build new identities based on honesty, rather than criminal participation. 2 years after Donovan's arrest, I was sitting in a federal courthouse in Denver, preparing to deliver final testimony in the prosecution of the last Mendoza cartel operatives who had evaded the initial arrests. The courtroom was packed with law enforcement officials, federal prosecutors, and family members of victims whose lives had been destroyed by the drug trafficking organization that Chester's evidence had helped dismantle. Mrs. Barnes, please describe for the jury your discovery of your husband's involvement with the Mendoza money laundering operation, requested Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Williams, using my protected identity while guiding me through testimony that would conclude years of legal proceedings. I became suspicious when my husband began making secretive weekly trips that he couldn't explain adequately. Using location tracking technology, I discovered that my husband was meeting someone at the Riverside Hotel every Friday without exception for exactly 2 hours. And what did you learn when you confronted your husband about these meetings? The prosecutor asked. I learned that Chester had been forced to participate in criminal activity after drug cartel operatives threatened to murder our entire family, our children and our grandchildren, if he refused to help them launder millions of dollars in drug proceeds. The defense attorney for Miguel Santos, the last major cartel figure still facing prosecution, leaned forward. His strategy was clear. Paint Chester as a willing criminal who had fabricated coercion to escape responsibility. Mrs. Barnes, he said, isn't it true that your husband participated in money laundering operations for 8 years because the financial compensation was substantial, rather than because he feared for your family's safety? No, I replied firmly. That is completely false. My husband received no compensation for his participation. The cartel threatened to kill our children and grandchildren if he refused to help transfer drug money through legitimate financial institutions. But Mrs. Barnes, the attorney continued, your family lived quite comfortably during the years your husband was laundering money for the Mendoza organization. Doesn't that suggest you benefited financially from criminal activity? We lived comfortably because we had saved money during 40 years of legitimate employment, long before my husband was coerced into criminal participation. Our lifestyle didn't improve because of the cartel. It deteriorated. Our lives became dominated by fear and secrecy that nearly destroyed our marriage. Federal prosecutors had prepared me extensively for these attacks. They warned me the defense would attempt to portray Chester as greedy rather than threatened, calculating rather than trapped. I was ready. I would defend my husband's character while acknowledging the terrible complexity of his situation. Mrs. Barnes, the attorney said, Your husband could have contacted federal authorities at any point during these 8 years of alleged coercion. Why didn't he seek law enforcement protection instead of continuing to commit crimes? Because cartel operatives warned him that they had sources within federal agencies, I answered. They told him that if we attempted to seek protection, the cartel would be alerted immediately, and our family would be killed. They said our only safety came from continued cooperation that kept their employers satisfied. And you believe these threats were credible? Yes. I believe them because they showed us detailed surveillance files, our children's daily routines, our grandchildren's school schedules, our family's vulnerabilities. These weren't vague warnings. They were professional assessments conducted by people who specialized in eliminating witnesses and their families. When my testimony concluded, I joined Chester in the witness waiting area, where federal marshals provided constant security. The proceedings had drawn international attention from law enforcement agencies tracking organized crime prosecutions. How did it go? Chester asked, taking my hand with the gentle affection that had sustained our marriage through 8 years of coercion and 2 years of federal protection. I think the jury understood, I said. They saw that our family was victimized by professional criminals, not willing participants in drug trafficking. Agent Morrison told me Miguel Santos is likely to receive life imprisonment if convicted, Chester said. That would mean every major figure in the Mendoza financial network has finally been prosecuted. That would end our active cooperation, I replied. But not our need for protection. Agent Morrison warned me that international drug organizations sometimes seek revenge, even years after successful prosecutions. Viv, Chester said softly, I'd rather spend the rest of my life as Charles Barnes under federal protection than live another day as Chester Hartwell under cartel control. That evening, Emma and Jake joined us for dinner at our secure residence, bringing their families. These weekly gatherings had become sacred, repairing relationships strained by years of fear and secrecy. Grandma Vivian, Sophie asked. She was 8 now, fully adjusted to her protected identity, though sometimes confused by the gaps in family history she couldn't share with friends. Will we ever be able to use our real names again? Sweetheart, I said gently, our safety matters more than our names. As long as we're together and happy, what people call us doesn't matter. But I miss telling people about Grandpa Chester's engineering projects, she said, and your library volunteer work. My heart ached. Our grandchildren carried false backgrounds that erased decades of legitimate accomplishment and community service. Still, I was grateful they could talk about their futures without fearing assassination. Grandpa Charles does engineering consulting now, I explained carefully, helping federal agencies protect other families from dangerous criminals. And Grandma Vivian volunteers at the local school, Emma added, helping children with reading programs. Jake had built a successful consulting practice of his own, legitimate, independent, and strong enough to support his family without relying on protection funds. Dad, Jake said during a family meeting, if federal protection funding is ever reduced, my business is doing well enough to help support everyone. Thank you, son, Chester replied. But federal authorities have assured us that protection costs will be covered indefinitely, in recognition of our cooperation dismantling a major criminal organization. 3 months later, Miguel Santos was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The Mendoza cartel's financial network was officially destroyed. Mrs. Barnes, Agent Morrison told us during our final debriefing, your family's cooperation resulted in the conviction of 43 cartel members and the seizure of more than $200 million in criminal assets. And what happens now? I asked. Are we free to live normal civilian lives again? The Mendoza organization has been dismantled, he said. But international drug trafficking continues. Other criminal groups may still view your family as valuable targets for recruitment or elimination. We recommend maintaining your protected identities permanently. As we adjusted to permanent life under federal protection, I reflected on how everything had begun, with suspicions about my husband's Friday afternoons, and ended with the dismantling of one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in North America. Do you regret losing our old identity? I asked one evening. Our community, our history? I regret the 8 years of coercion that forced us to abandon our life, Chester said. But I don't regret your courage, or our family's decision to choose justice over fear. Some wives track their husbands and discover infidelity that can be resolved with counseling. I tracked mine and uncovered criminal conspiracy that required federal intervention to save our family and help prosecute international drug traffickers. We traded a comfortable retirement in familiar surroundings for permanent, protective custody. In return, we gained safety, justice, and the knowledge that our grandchildren could grow up without fear of assassination. And every evening, as we sat together in our secure home planning futures free from criminal control, I felt grateful for the AirTag that had started our journey toward freedom. 5 years after that first tracking alert revealed the truth about Chester's Friday meetings, I stood in the kitchen of our permanent home in Colorado, preparing Thanksgiving dinner for a family made stronger by surviving cartel threats and choosing life over fear. Our grandchildren had adjusted completely to their protected identities, while Chester and I had built a new life rooted in honesty rather than criminal coercion. "Vivian, the turkey smells perfect," Chester said, using my protected name with the natural ease we developed after years of living as Charles and Vivian Barnes instead of Chester and Margaret Hartwell. "Charles," I replied. "I've been thinking about how much our family has changed since that first tracking discovery. Do you ever miss aspects of our previous life?" "I miss the community connections and professional relationships we built over 30 years in Portland," he said thoughtfully. "But I don't miss the fear, secrecy, or constant anxiety about our family's safety that defined our final years as the Hartwells." Emma and Jake arrived with their families, bringing children who now thought of Colorado as home rather than a temporary refuge from threats they'd never fully understood. Sophie was 13, Tyler 11, both thriving in schools where they could form genuine friendships without elaborate cover stories about their family background. "Grandma Vivian," Sophie announced during dinner preparation, "my teacher wants me to do a family history project about our ancestors. What should I tell her about our background before we moved to Colorado?" "Tell her that your family came to Colorado when your grandfather retired from consulting work," I said gently, "and that we were originally from the Midwest, where we lived quietly before relocating for health and climate reasons." "Can I mention Grandpa's engineering career?" "You can say he worked as an engineering consultant for various companies," I answered, "but don't include specific projects or locations that might contradict our current background." The complexity of maintaining protected identities while nurturing genuine family relationships had become second nature after 5 years of practice, though we still felt occasional sadness at erasing legitimate accomplishments and decades of community contribution from our official histories. "Mom," Emma said later during the gathering, "I received an interesting call from Agent Morrison yesterday. She said federal agencies have been using evidence from our case to identify and prosecute money laundering operations run by other international criminal organizations." "What kind of prosecutions?" I asked. "Apparently Dad's financial documentation provided insight into sophisticated money transfer techniques that several drug trafficking organizations have been using throughout the western United States." Chester had become an unofficial consultant to federal agencies investigating organized financial crimes, offering expertise about laundering methods while maintaining strict security protocols around his protected identity. "Charles," I asked him quietly, "how do you feel about your criminal participation ultimately helping federal authorities protect other families from similar coercion?" "I feel like our suffering served some purpose if it prevented other families from enduring 8 years of criminal victimization," he said. "The knowledge I gained about cartel financial operations came through trauma, but at least it's now being used to prosecute genuine criminals." "And how do you feel about Donovan spending the rest of his life in federal prison?" He paused before answering, still processing the complicated emotions surrounding his twin brother's choices. "I feel sadness for the brother I lost in 1983 when Donovan chose criminal activity over family relationships," he said finally. "But I also feel satisfied that the man who threatened our family and coerced me into criminal participation is facing consequences for 40 years of decisions that destroyed communities and terrorized innocent people." That evening, after our children and grandchildren returned to their homes, Chester and I sat on the front porch reflecting on how dramatically our lives had changed since I discovered his secret meetings with Donovan. "Vivian," he asked quietly, "do you regret placing that AirTag in my briefcase? Do you wish you'd never investigated my suspicious behavior?" "Charles, that investigation saved our family from indefinite criminal participation," I said firmly. and provided evidence that helped convict dozens of drug traffickers. If I hadn't been curious about your Friday meetings, we might still be living under cartel control, or worse, we might have been arrested as willing participants in money laundering operations. Exactly, he agreed. Your surveillance probably saved us from federal prosecution, while documenting criminal coercion authorities needed to understand the scope of cartel operations. 6 months later, I received a call from Agent Morrison that would mark the final chapter of our involvement with federal law enforcement. Mrs. Barnes, she said, I'm calling with news that will affect your family's long-term security status. Federal authorities have successfully disrupted the last known criminal organizations that posed ongoing threats to witnesses from the Mendoza prosecutions. What does that mean for our protected status? It means your family may resume limited contact with previous communities and relationships, though we still recommend maintaining your current identities for optimal security. So we could visit Portland or contact old friends with precautions? Yes. The immediate threats that required complete isolation have been eliminated through successful prosecutions. That summer, Chester and I made our first trip back to Portland since entering federal protection. Under careful surveillance by federal agents, we drove through neighborhoods that held decades of memories. The house looks exactly the same, I said as we passed our former home, now occupied by a young family who had redesigned the garden to suit their own lives. I feel strange seeing other people living in spaces where we raised our children and planned our retirement, Chester said. Do you regret leaving Portland? I asked. I regret the circumstances that forced us to leave, he replied. But I don't regret choosing our family's safety over familiar surroundings. We visited Morrison's family restaurant, where we'd shared countless meals during our 35-year marriage, and Colia River Credit Union, where we once managed modest finances before discovering Chester's involvement in multimillion-dollar laundering operations. It feels like visiting a previous life that belonged to different people, Chester reflected. But we're still the same people, I said. We just have a deeper appreciation for honesty and safety after surviving 8 years of criminal victimization. I had placed an AirTag in my husband's briefcase because I believed he was having an affair when he began visiting the same hotel every Friday. When I found bank records showing $6.3 million in an account under his supposedly dead brother's name, I discovered the truth. My husband wasn't cheating. He was being forced to launder money for drug cartels that threatened to kill our entire family if he stopped cooperating. The tracking device intended to confirm infidelity instead documented criminal conspiracy, dismantled an international organization, and saved our family from years of terror. At 68, I was no longer Margaret Hartwell, the retired math teacher who had lived quietly in suburban Portland. I was Vivian Barnes, a federal witness whose curiosity and determination helped prosecute one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in North America, while securing my family's survival. The AirTag that was meant to expose betrayal instead revealed coercion. And through that discovery, our marriage endured what secrecy nearly destroyed. Love and trust survived because we chose honesty over deception, and justice over fear. Some marriages ended when wives uncovered their husbands' hidden lives. Ours was strengthened by surviving criminal victimization together, and building a future rooted in truth. The end.